Welcome. We're discussing now the animal tissues after we're done with the plant tissues. The animal tissues, similar to plant tissues, they're composed of groups of identical cells specialized to perform specific functions. So here the concept of a tissue did not change. Okay, the concept of a tissue is still the same. Tissue is a tissue, whether if it was in a plant or animal. The cells within a tissue may sometimes vary, and the intercellular substances can also differ between tissues, not only in structure but also in chemical composition. The animal tissues are classified into 4 primary tissues. For example, you can have a question telling you to list only the primary animal tissues. There are the epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. We're starting with the epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue covers the surface of the body that comes into contact with the external environment. So the epithelial tissue does line the body surfaces that are exposed to the environment, such as the skin, like the epidermis, the respiratory tract, the mouth, the anus, the urinary tract, the reproductive tract. So all of these that come into contact with the external environment are actually mucosal or cutaneous surfaces that open to the outside world. And they're made up of epithelium. But this is not always the case. Like, epithelium is not only found in the structures that are exposed to the external environment, they're also found in the inner structures like blood vessels and some organ linings. And of course, it lines the internal body cavities. Additionally, it forms glands. So glands are made up of epithelial tissue. You can have a question like telling you what is the type of tissues for each of the following and telling you glands in general without being specific. Because if they be specific, if they ask specific questions about the glands, like telling you what is the type of tissue of this gland, like the ducts of sweat glands, the answer of course is going to differ because we want specific answer. But if they ask about the glands in general, they're made up of epithelium. And if they ask you about the type of tissue of surface of the body that comes into contact with the external environment, the answer is also epithelium or epithelial tissue. The tissue type has the following distinctive characteristics. For example, you can have a question telling you what are the characteristics or features of the epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissue consists of continuous sheets of cells arranged in one or more layers. So in one or more layers, if we have a one layer, like a monolayer, this is going to be simple epithelial tissue. And if we have more than one layer, like multiple layers, this is going to be stratified, meaning made up of multiple layers. All epithelial cells rest on a basement membrane. You should know that every time you look at an epithelial tissue, every time you see that the cells rest on basement membrane. The basement membrane is where the cells rest. It's basically where the cells rest, and always or almost always you can see connective tissue below to this basement membrane. Okay, so in histology, if you see epithelium, look right below. You'll almost always find loose connective tissue there, often called lamina propria, especially if the tissue type is mucous membrane. Epithelial cells are separated by minimal intercellular space and contain almost no intercellular substance. The ends of the cells are tightly connected at multiple points by cell junctions, aka plasmic junctions. Epithelial tissue is classified into two main types based on the number of the cell layers it contains. As I said, we have simple and stratified epithelial tissues. Question: all epithelial cells rest on basement membrane. What is the function of basement membrane? This is an important question here. All epithelial cells rest on it. Question: define basement membrane. It is a thin supportive layer upon which all epithelial cells rest, providing structural support and anchoring the epithelium to underlying tissues. Define cell junction or plasmic junctions. They are specialized structures at the ends of the epithelial cells that tightly connect them to one another, ensuring cohesion and communication between the cells. Okay, so the cells communicate with each other. They connect with each other through these junctions. Question: epithelial cells are separated by minimal blank and contain almost no blank. So minimal intercellular space and contain almost no intercellular substance. Question: epithelial cells are connected by cell junctions. Okay, so they are connected with each other by cell junctions or plasmic junctions as the book describes it. Question: the ends of epithelial cells are tightly connected at multiple points by cell junctions or plasmic junctions. Question: epithelial tissue is classified into two main types based on the number of what it contains. The layers, okay, the cell layers. So as I said, if we have one layer, it's simple. If more than one or multiple layers, we have stratified. We're going to start with the simple epithelial tissue. So the simple meaning we have only one layer of epithelial cells that rests on basement membrane. It is further classified into several types based on the shape of the cells. So based on what? Based on the shape of the cell. You can have a blank question here like, it is for example, telling you that simple epithelial tissue is further classified based on blank. So it's going to be based on the shape of its cells. Okay, we have to know that the classification here happening based on the shape of the cell. So we're going to have simple squamous epithelial tissue. Squamous cells are flattened cells. They look like flattened cells. Simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and pseudostratified columnar epithelial. Here you can also possibly have a question telling you to list only the classification of simple epithelial tissue based on the shape of cells, or just telling you to list the classification of simple epithelial tissue. So in the simple squamous epithelial tissue, here are the characteristics or features of the tissue. You can have like a whole question just asking you about the features or characteristics of the tissue, and you write everything. Or you can have like some small questions asking you about a specific thing. So let's see what we have here. It says that this type of epithelial tissue consists of a single layer of flattened cells with a polygonal shape and a centrally located flat nucleus. So if they ask you about the cells like they ask you, describe the cells of simple epithelial tissue, or what are the characteristics or feature of the cells of the simple squamous epithelium, the answer is going to be they're flattened cells and they're polygonal in shape. They have a centrally located nucleus and a flat nucleus. Okay, so centrally located flat nucleus. And it is, of course, a single layer of cells. So always write this down, single layer of cells, if the tissue is simple. Another possible question is just asking you to describe the nucleus of the cells of simple squamous epithelium, or what are their characteristics, or what are the features of the nucleus of the cells of simple squamous epithelium. And the answer is centrally located flat nucleus. This epithelial tissue covers the inner lining of blood vessels, body cavities, lung vesicles, or pulmonary alveoli, or alveoli. Because the term lung vesicles is weird. It doesn't make sense to me. So they are probably referring to pulmonary alveoli. Although this terminology seems unusual, but you have to memorize it as presented in the book for exam purposes. And of course, we're going to have Malpighian corpuscles. The cells of simple squamous epithelial tissue function primarily in diffusion and filtration. Very important, they assess the function of each epithelium type. Okay, so remember that diffusion and filtration are associated with the simple squamous epithelium. Of course, the important questions we have here, they're asking you about what is the tissue type for each of the following. The inner lining of blood vessels, simple squamous epithelium. Inner lining of body cavities, definitely going to be simple squamous epithelium. The lung vesicles or lung alveoli, they're simple squamous epithelium. And Malpighian corpuscles, simple squamous. Question, what is the function of simple squamous epithelial tissues? Diffusion and filtration. Another question is that they reverse this question, meaning they can possibly give you a question telling you what does these sentences indicate. Okay, so they give you a scientific fact and what do they indicate, and let's say that a tissue type with the diffusion and filtration function, and you should write down simple squamous epithelium. Okay, so it's possible to assess the facts like this. Question, the nucleus of the cells of simple squamous epithelium are blank located. They are centrally located. The drawings, they're easy. Nothing hard about this. About the drawing questions, they can either tell you to directly draw the simple squamous epithelial tissue, or they can give you a sophisticated question where they're going to tell you draw with labeling blood vessel lining tissue, or the tissue type in blood vessels. Now the simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. Again, we're going to have the characteristics, and the classic question is like, what are the characteristics or features? And you write down everything. Or we're going to have specific questions where you're going to extract some like small answers from the text. Again, this type of epithelial tissue is composed of a single layer. Of course, single layer because it's simple. Every time we have a simple, it's single layer of cube-shaped cells which appear quadrangular in cross-section. I've already explained the cross-section in previous videos, so you should know what a cross-section is. I described it, I explained it, so make sure you watch the previous videos if you don't know what cross-section is. And they have centrally located spherical nuclei. This tissue is found lining the kinetotubules and in certain glands, such as the salivary glands. And simple cuboidal epithelial tissue functions in both secretion and absorption. So you can have a question: what is the type of tissue in each inner lining of the kinetotubules and salivary glands? The answer is simple cuboidal. Question: what's the function of simple cuboidal epithelial tissue? Both secretion and absorption. What are the characteristics or features of simple cuboidal epithelial tissues? So, of course, we always write this down. It's a single layer because it's simple. And it's cube-shaped cells, but they appear quadrangular in cross-section. And they have central located spherical nuclei. Very important question, extremely important question, is they tell you to justify or explain that simple cuboidal tissue cells sometimes appear quadrangular, or the cells of simple cuboidal tissue appear quadrangular when viewed under the microscope. The answer here is going to be because when cut in cross-section, they appear square-shaped and have central located spherical nuclei. So because when they are cut in cross-section, they appear like this. Okay, that's the answer. Question: what are the characteristics or features of the nucleus of simple cuboidal epithelial tissue or cells? And we described the nucleus. We said they're centrally located and spherical in shape. And the drawings, they can either directly tell you to draw the simple cuboidal epithelial tissue or the tissue lining the kidney tubules. This is just a sophisticated question they can create to mean the same thing. Simple columnar epithelial tissue. Characteristics or features. The cells of this type of epithelial tissue are shaped like long columns and typically appear rectangular in cross-section. So they look like a long column, but they appear rectangular in cross-section. Their nuclei are oval shaped and located close to the basement membrane. So the nuclei are more to the base, close to the basement membrane. Possibly they ask you about the location of the nucleus of this cell. This tissue forms the inner lining, meaning the epithelium of the intestines, and is also found in some glands. Simple columnar epithelial tissue serves the function of protection, secretion, and absorption. Now, if you see that almost all of the types of tissues have similar functions, but there's like some very little nuance or very little difference. And this little difference is going to depend on what you're going to write down. Okay, because as I said, they very possibly say that give you a question and telling you what do these sentences indicate, and telling you a tissue type with the function of protection, secretion, and absorption. And you're like, I don't know, that's like anything. Like literally could be anything. But no, you should know, where did they describe this thing in the book? Okay, so here they described protection plus secretion plus absorption. If you see these three, this is the simple columnar epithelial tissue. Because the book wants you to learn like this, okay? The book wants you to learn in that you memorize how the book phrases the thing, okay? And this is like half of the questions. Half the questions are going to be assessed like this, like you memorize how are they phrased in the book. Now, the book refers to the inner lining of the intestines as endothelium, which is incorrect. The term endothelium specifically describes the lining of lymphatic vessels, blood vessels, and the heart. The correct term for the inner lining of the intestine is epithelium, more specifically the simple columnar epithelium. However, if the book presents it differently, we should follow its usage for exam purposes. But trust me, there's no such thing. We don't call the lining of the intestine endothelium. This is like a disaster. Question: justify. Cells of simple columnar epithelial tissue sometimes appear rectangular, or cells of simple columnar epithelial tissue appear rectangular when viewed under the microscope, because when cut in cross-section, okay, that's the answer, because they're cut in cross-section, they appear rectangle shaped. Question: what is the type of tissue for each of the following? The inner lining of the intestine. Of course, it's the simple columnar epithelial tissue. You can get the question reversed. For example, question: simple columnar epithelial tissue is found in, or simple columnar epithelial tissue is found in blank and blank. This is going to be the inner lining or the epithelium of the intestine and some glands. Question: what is the function of simple columnar epithelial tissue or cells? The function, we mentioned 3. We said protection, secretion, absorption. Question: what are the characteristics or features of simple columnar epithelial cells? The characteristics of the cells, of course, we always mention that they're a single layer because it's simple, and the cells are shaped like a long column, but they appear rectangular in cross-section, and their nuclei are oval-shaped and located close to the basement membrane. Again, they can ask you about the location of the nuclei of simple columnar epithelial cells, and the answer is that they are close to the basement membrane. Question: what are the characteristics or features for the simple columnar epithelial cells nuclei? And they're oval-shaped and located close to the basement membrane. Okay, oval-shaped, don't forget this. Don't forget the description here. They're oval-shaped. Question: draw with labeling the ciliated simple columnar epithelial tissue. That's the example we have in the book. So they said ciliated because sometimes this tissue can be provided with cilia at the apex. So we call it ciliated simple columnar epithelial. And when you draw it, of course, it will draw the cilia. Okay, and the cilia are just projections that function in the movement of substances and transport, and sometimes they can have microvilli, which is going to increase the surface area. And another sophisticated drawing question you can have is that they tell you to draw the inner lining of the intestine. The final simple epithelial tissue we have is the pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. Now, the word pseudo means something that is fake or wrong or something like this, or something with similar context. Okay, so when I say pseudostratified, meaning that it is fake stratified or like masked stratified. Okay, so it looks like it is stratified, but it is actually simple. So this tissue is composed of more than one type of cell, and the nuclei are located at different levels, which gives the false impression that the tissue consists of multiple layers. However, all the cells rest on the basement membrane. Since all of these cells rest on the basement membrane, so all of the cells actually touch the basement membrane, this cannot be considered as a stratified tissue because we have one layer here, technically. Since all of the cell bases actually in contact with the basement membrane, this is a simple tissue, not a stratified tissue. But because the cells look weird, one looks like that, for example, one that looks high and one looks very low, due to the nucleus location and due to the shape of the cell, it can vaguely give you the impression that they're stratified, but they're actually simple. When the free surface of the cells is covered with cilia, this tissue is referred to as ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. This type of epithelial tissue is found lining the trachea and the large ducts of the salivary glands. The primary functions of the tissue are production and secretion. Note, the book says endothelium of the trachea. Of course, this is wrong. The term endothelium is used exclusively for the inner lining of the blood and lymphatic vessels and the heart. The correct term here is the epithelium. Still, if the book insists otherwise, just memorize it for the test and pretend you didn't see it. Because trust me, in medical context and medical terms, saying trachea endothelium is like a disaster. It's a disaster. Like, it's terrible. So please only use this word endothelium of trachea in the context of this book. Never use this word like outside of this context. Question: what is the type of tissue for each of the following? Lining the trachea and large ducts of salivary glands, or salivary ducts actually, not the glands. And the answer is pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. Question: what's the function for each? The pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue, or cells. Protection and secretion. Question: what are the characteristics or features of the pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells? So if they ask you about the cells here, it is single-layered because it is considered simple. And why is it considered simple? Because all of these cells rest on the basement membrane. But it gives the false impression that the tissue consists of multiple layers because the nuclei are located at different levels. And 2 sometimes is covered by cilia and is then called the ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And if they ask you about the location of the nuclei, located at different levels, which gives them the false impression that the tissue consists of multiple layers. Question: how can you microscopically differentiate between the lining of the blood vessels and the lining of the trachea? It's really easy. Like, you just need to mention the type of the tissue involved. But some students freak out when they see the word microscopically, like, I don't know what to write down, what is this? Calm down, okay? It's nothing. So, as long as you know that the lining of blood vessels is single-layered of flattened cells with polygonal shape and centrally located flat nucleus, I'm describing the type of the tissue here, which is the simple squamous epithelium. And here, I'm describing the for the lining of the trachea, I'm going to describe the tissue that is lining the trachea, which is the pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So I'm going to say, okay, the nuclei are located at different levels, and give them the false impression that the tissue consists of multiple layers. Question: justify. The pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue is named as such, or the tissue lining the trachea is called pseudostratified epithelial tissue. Like, why do we call this pseudostratified? Nothing new here, because the nuclei are located at different levels, which give them the false impression that the tissue consists of multiple layers. However, all the cells rest on basement membrane. When the free surface of the cells is covered with cilia, the tissue is referred to as ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And of course, the drawing question that you need to take care of. As you can see here, the tissue is basically all of these cells are in contact with the basement membrane here. But as you can see here, so these are like some short cells and long cells. Since all of these cells are actually in contact, this is monolayered. This is a single layer, not multiple layers. And finally, the table for the location and function comparison of each tissue, or of each epithelial tissue.